Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Delve. Today we're working on yet another prototype. The prototype we'll be trying to build today is inspired by Nintendo's seed-gathering, horde-controlling adventure franchise, Pikmin. Now, usually this is where I'd show you some footage of the game in action, but Nintendo ain't too fond of that type of thing, so instead I'll have to describe it. First, I have to admit I haven't actually had the pleasure of playing a Pikmin game, so our prototype is less of a clone and more of an inspired by type of thing. Anyway, as I understand it, Pikmin is broken down into three main parts: gather minions, lead minions, and use minions to accomplish various goals. And so that's the 3 points our prototype will be built on. We'll focus on being able to obtain minions by picking them up from the ground, then we'll have the minions follow the player, and finally we'll use those minions by simply tossing them around. Sounds like a plan, so let's get to the coding. First up was grabbing our little minions. I started by checking that a seed even exists, and if it does, we were ready to go. If the player hits the grab key, the code would check for the nearest seed to the player. If the player is close enough, that seed would be destroyed and a minion spawned in its place. And just to confirm that the player's in range, I had the seed display a little prompt. And just like that, we had our little spawn system for our minions added, which we can simply pluck out of the ground just like in Pikmin. So with that done, it was time to move on to the minion movement. Now, the reason I wanted to work on this prototype was to test GameMaker's limits and also work more with unit movement. We've dealt with pathfinding on smaller scales in the past, and we've dealt with companion movement in relation to the player, but never have I tried it on a more massive, more complicated scale. So first I decided to try something simple. Instead of going straight to the pathfinding, I wanted the minion to simply move with and stay behind the player. Using some math to make the movement much smoother, I did just that. And for this prototype, instead of doing a top-down image angle approach, I went with a 2D side view approach, which meant flipping the player's sprite depending on the mouse's position. This raised an interesting issue with the minions. If they had to always be behind the player, that means the minions would have to dart around if the player turns. But luckily, thanks to the smoother movement, this made the transition much less jarring than I expected. So instead of trying to get any more complicated, I opted to move on and see what 100, the maximum amount of minions Pikmin allows at a time, would look like in GameMaker. And needless to say that while it worked, the minion position definitely needed to be tweaked. So to help with variation, I added random X and Y offsets, as well as a random walk speed. And with a bit of tweaking to the numbers, I managed to create a much more organic looking mob of minions. So at this point, it seemed GameMaker could handle 100 plus units on screen at once pretty well. But how would it do when things got complicated? Well, there's only one way to find out. I set up our pathfinding grid, the same one we've used in the past, and applied it to our minion. I had the minion check for path of the player, but like before, the minion always has to be behind the player. It took a bit of tweaking the numbers to get the minions to move properly, but eventually I was able to basically reproduce our previous movement, only now with the pathfinding system. However, while testing, I noticed that over time, the frame rate started to chug to almost unbearable levels. Turns out adding a new path every step was a bad idea. With the path creation moved to the create event, that solved our frame rate issue. But it did not solve our positioning issue. Due to having to be behind the player, when too close to the wall, minions would reset and glitch out. Another issue was, obviously, performance took a larger hit when pathfinding was active than without. And while I managed to maintain 60 frames, these were just the minions we're talking about. In other words, I can see why, from a technical standpoint, Pikmin-style games aren't more common. But despite this, I wanted to at least complete our goal, so I moved on to our next step, utilizing the minions. Admittedly, I was a little discouraged at this point, so I simply wanted to do one thing: toss the minions to where the mouse directs them, which is almost directly lifted from Pikmin itself. But first, I set up a cap on the minion acquisition. First, I check for the number of minions active, and if the player has 100 minions already active, they were unable to pick up new ones via the seeds we coded earlier. And just for visual feedback purposes, I had the prompt display an X when no new minions could be added. Now, moving on to the utilization of minions, I added 2 new variables to keep track of distance and direction of the mouse in relation to the player. Then I drew a line from player to mouse. Next, I moved on to the minion code and added a state variable and switch function, placing our movement code in state 0, which would be our default state. In the player code, I set up a cooldown state and basically treated the tossing of minions as a weapon. It would check for the nearest minion to the player, and if the cooldown was at 0, the minion would have its state changed to the toss state, and all the information it would need would be passed on. Back in the minion code, I added a state timer to give the minion a few frames to buffer before actually being tossed. Yes, this was an unnecessary and preemptive move. Anyway, I then set up a variable that would keep track of the minion's distance to its destination, and once the minion reached its destination, it would cease moving and would await further instructions. I'll save you the next 25 minutes of frustration and say it did not work. No matter what I tried, the minion would take off, but never stop. I checked distances, I set up different parameters, nothing would work. The minion refused to stop at its destination, and it just made no sense. And with each failed attempt to fix it, the saltier I got. Eventually, I started whittling down my code and removed that preemptive state timer I randomly tossed in. And finally, it worked. Yes, due to my own silly eagerness, I managed to cause the issue of minions never stopping at their destination. So, with that revelation made and that code removed, everything worked as I'd imagined it to. But, thanks to my foolishness, I was out of time. Granted, we managed to complete our goals for this session, but I think there may be more to learn from this project, so I may return to it in the future. I mean, the pathfinding issue alone has me intrigued enough to take another look. But for now, that'll do it for this episode of Let's Delve. So remember that if you like this video or enjoy Let's Delve in general, be sure to hit that like button. If you aren't already subscribed, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. And as always, be sure to leave your thoughts on our prototype in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.